The courtroom buzzed with the electric tension of a high-profile case, the air thick with murmurs and the clatter of hurried footsteps. Every inch of space seemed crowded, the seats filled with curious onlookers, reporters scribbling frantic notes, and lawyers exchanging terse words. At the heart of it all, Judge Isabella Grant sat in her elevated chair, her expression unreadable, as she adjusted her glasses with a faint sigh. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that seemed to offer any comfort, but it did little to ease the storm brewing inside her. This was her courtroom, but today the walls felt smaller than usual, more suffocating. And it wasn't just because of the stakes of the case that lay before her. It was because of him, Nathan Carter, the defendant. Nathan, the boy she used to laugh with in the schoolyard, the boy who had once sworn to protect her, had somehow become the man accused of a crime he claimed he didn't commit. And she was the one who had to decide his fate. Isabella shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming nervously on the mahogany desk. This was a trial that could change everything, not just for Nathan, but for her too. The stakes were higher than anyone could understand. For years, she had worked her way to this position, climbed higher than she had ever dreamed possible. But now, as she stared at Nathan, she couldn't shake the feeling that this trial was somehow a test of everything she had believed in. The door to the courtroom opened, and in walked the prosecutor, Daniel Reed, his perfectly tailored suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the crowd. His confidence was almost palpable, his eyes gleaming with the certainty of a man who knew his case was solid. As he made his way to the prosecution's table, his gaze met Isabella's. A fleeting, subtle nod passed between them, but neither of them spoke. Across from him sat Maya Brooks, Nathan's defense attorney. Maya's reputation was growing fast, and though she was young, she had an uncanny ability to make the courtroom feel like a battlefield. Her demeanor was calm, but beneath the surface, Isabella could tell she was brimming with strategy, her mind calculating every move with precision. And then there was Nathan, sitting at the defendant's table, his face stoic, but with an edge of nervousness that even his years in prison couldn't erase. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and Isabella's stomach twisted. There were so many things she had yet to understand. Was Nathan guilty? Or was he the victim of a system that had failed him from the start? As the trial began, Isabella took a deep breath. This was it. The evidence, the witnesses, the testimonies, all of it would unfold in front of her. The truth would be revealed. Or, at least, she hoped it would be. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a knife. Isabella nodded, adjusting the gavel in her hand. She tried to ignore the nervous energy that had settled deep in her chest. The past had no place here. Not today. Today, it was about justice. Today, it was about making the right call. The prosecutor stood and cleared his throat. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the case before us is one of undeniable guilt. Nathan Carter stands accused of armed robbery, and the evidence will prove his involvement beyond a reasonable doubt. Daniel's voice rang out with a smooth certainty, his eyes locking on each member of the jury. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. Then he turned toward Nathan, a look of disdain flashing across his face. Mr. Carter, a man with a history of violence and criminal behavior, is once again before this court. This time, we have the irrefutable proof fingerprints on the weapon, a witness who saw him leave the scene. The facts speak for themselves. Your Honor, Isabella didn't flinch, though she felt the pressure building. The case was strong. She couldn't deny that, but she also couldn't ignore the whispers that crept into her mind. Nathan had always been reckless. Yes, but was he capable of such a crime? Was this a case of guilt, or was something else at play here? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Maya standing, her voice cutting through the tension like a breeze through the heat. Your Honor, if I may, Maya began, her tone calm but firm. "We intend to prove that Nathan Carter is not guilty of the crime he's been accused of. The evidence, as presented, is incomplete at best. There are holes, inconsistencies, and we will show that someone else, someone who has been allowed to remain in the shadows, is responsible for the crime." Isabella's gaze flickered over to Maya, who was now focused on Nathan, her expression fierce, determined. It was at that moment that Isabella felt the weight of the case settle onto her shoulders. The battle lines had been drawn, and somehow she was at the center of it all. The trial had only just begun. The courtroom felt alive, humming with the anticipation of the trial's opening statements. Isabella Grant sat at the helm, her fingers gripping the edges of her gavel as she observed the battle unfolding before her. The air was thick with the weight of the case, the kind of case that made your palms sweat and your heartbeat quicken. Daniel Reed, the prosecutor, stood tall, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a man who knew he was winning. He had the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. But in a trial like this, it was a weapon as sharp as any knife. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "today we present to you a man who has been caught red-handed. Nathan Carter stands accused of armed robbery. We have irrefutable evidence, fingerprints on the weapon, an eyewitness account, and most importantly, the unmistakable trail of a criminal who has slipped through the cracks of justice for far too long." Isabella felt the tension in the room tighten, like the pull of a noose. Daniel turned and pointed toward Nathan, who sat at the defendant's table, his face still and unreadable. "This man, despite his claims of innocence, has a long history of criminal activity. He was found with the stolen goods, and his fingerprints were discovered on the very weapon used in the crime. We will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Nathan Carter is guilty." Nathan's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. His eyes flickered briefly to Isabella, but she didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she focused on Daniel, watching him carefully. There was something about the way he spoke that unsettled her, the way he said irrefutable evidence, as if there were no room for doubt. Isabella could already feel her mind starting to churn with questions. Could it really be that simple? Could this man, who she had known as a child, really be the cold-blooded criminal Daniel painted him to be? Across the room, Maya Brooks stood and adjusted the collar of her jacket. She didn't flinch under the weight of Daniel's words. If anything, she seemed more determined, her eyes sharp and calculating as she prepared to strike back. "Your Honor," Maya said, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a sharp blade. "We do not deny the existence of certain pieces of evidence, but I urge you to consider the possibility that Nathan Carter is the victim of a system that has already passed judgment on him before he even had a chance." Maya paused, letting her words linger in the room. She turned toward the jury, her gaze sweeping across each face. "We have seen this story before. A man from the wrong side of the tracks, labeled a criminal before he has even had the chance to prove himself. Is that what we call justice?" Daniel's lips curled into a tight smile, and he was about to respond when Isabella raised a hand. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We will have order in this court." She paused, looking between the two attorneys. There was something simmering beneath the surface of Maya's words, something Isabella wasn't ready to acknowledge just yet. Was Maya right? Was Nathan truly the victim here? Or was this just another defense tactic? The courtroom fell silent as Isabella leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning with questions. She needed more than words. She needed the truth. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice firm, "you may proceed with your evidence." Daniel wasted no time, and with a swift motion, he turned toward the courtroom screen. He pressed a button, and a video appeared on the large screen, showing a grainy security camera image of a man, Nathan, walking briskly past a convenience store, holding a bag that was unmistakably heavy with stolen goods. The timestamp on the video read just moments after the robbery had been reported. Daniel pointed to the screen. "This is Mr. Carter leaving the scene of the crime. His gait, his posture, everything about this image confirms his involvement. His actions were calculated. He knew exactly what he was doing. Isabella watched closely, trying to see what Daniel saw, but all she could make out was a blurry figure. The man in the video was wearing a hood, and it was difficult to make out any distinguishing features. Mr. Reed, Isabella interjected, her voice steady but with a hint of skepticism. You're telling me this image is irrefutable proof? It's unclear. It could be anyone. Daniel didn't waver. We have his fingerprints on the weapon, Your Honor. This image is just the beginning. We will prove that Nathan Carter is guilty, and we will do so with facts, not assumptions. Isabella shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze lingering on Nathan. She could see his jaw tight with tension, his hands trembling ever so slightly. He didn't look like a hardened criminal, but then again, appearances could be deceiving. As the prosecution continued its case, Isabella's mind was already drifting ahead, piecing together the cracks in the story. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. There was a sharpness to Daniel's case that didn't feel entirely genuine. Was it because of her past with Nathan, or was it something else? Maya's voice broke through her thoughts once again. We will show you, Your Honor, that Nathan Carter is not the man in that video, and we will prove that the real criminal is still out there, walking free. The room grew quieter as Maya sat down, her gaze locked on the judge. She was playing her cards carefully, but Isabella could see the fire in her eyes. The stage was set. The trial had begun in earnest, and Isabella Grant knew that every decision she made in the coming days would have consequences far beyond this courtroom. The courtroom had quieted once again, the weight of the evidence hanging heavily in the air. Isabella Grant sat at the bench, her gaze flicking from the screen to Nathan, and then to Daniel Reed, who now stood confidently, watching her every reaction. The flicker of the video, showing Nathan walking away from the scene, still lingered in her mind. The image wasn't clear, but the words irrefutable evidence kept echoing in her thoughts. Daniel was playing the game well, too well. Your Honor, Daniel spoke again, his voice smooth and unwavering. We have a crucial witness. Jordan Miles, a resident of the area, saw Mr. Carter leaving the scene immediately after the robbery. His testimony will confirm that the defendant was the one who committed the crime. The prosecutor motioned to the side, and a man in his late 40s stood up, walking toward the witness stand. Jordan Miles was a scruffy-looking man with a hardened face, his eyes darting nervously as he took his seat. Isabella studied him carefully. The nerves were evident, but his body language seemed rehearsed, like he had prepared for this moment. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice shaky. I was walking home that night, Your Honor. I saw him, Nathan Carter. He was carrying a bag, and he looked like he was in a hurry. I didn't know what was in the bag at the time, but I saw him running past me, heading away from the convenience store. Isabella tried to read his face, but the man's words were unwavering, too firm to be false. Or were they? She leaned forward. Mr. Miles, she began, her voice calm but probing. Could you tell the court exactly how far away you were from Mr. Carter when you saw him? Jordan hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the ground before he met her gaze. About 10 feet, Your Honor. Maybe a little more. It was dark, but I saw enough to know it was him. Isabella narrowed her eyes. There were a lot of questions left unanswered. The distance, the lighting, the time, it all seemed vague. How sure was he of what he'd seen? Was there anyone else with Mr. Carter that night? Isabella pressed. Jordan's expression faltered for a split second. No, it was just him. Isabella sat back in her chair, deep in thought. The testimony sounded too neat, too convenient. There were holes in the details, things that didn't quite add up. Before she could ask more questions, Daniel was already on his feet. moving forward to cross-examine. Mr. Miles, are you certain it was Mr. Carter you saw? Daniel asked, his voice soft but insistent. No doubts? Not a single moment of uncertainty? Jordan nodded quickly, his eyes widening slightly at the pressure. Yes, I'm sure. I know what I saw. Daniel gave a satisfied nod, then turned back toward the judge. Your Honor, we have no further questions. Isabella's mind was racing, the wheels turning as she processed what had just transpired. It was a clear testimony, but there was something wrong about it. Could Jordan be mistaken, or was he hiding something? As she pondered, Maya Brooks stood up. She moved gracefully, as if she were walking into an arena. The energy shifted, the courtroom holding its collective breath. She would play her part now. Your Honor, we would like to cross-examine the witness, Maya said, her tone firm but measured. Jordan looked at her warily as Maya walked towards the stand, her heels clicking lightly against the floor. Mr. Miles, she began, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it that made the audience lean forward. You claim you saw Nathan Carter leaving the scene of the crime. But what I want to know is this: how far did you actually see him? 10 feet? Or perhaps more? Because the lighting was poor, wasn't it? Jordan stammered, taken aback by the question. I already told you. It was dark, but I'm sure it was him. Maya pressed further. But aren't you also aware that Nathan Carter had a twin brother, a man named Ethan, who looked exactly like him? In fact, didn't you know Ethan Carter had been in trouble with the law before? Perhaps it was Ethan you saw, not Nathan? The words hung in the air like a bomb, and for a moment the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Isabella's gaze snapped back to Nathan, whose expression hadn't changed. But there was a flicker of something behind his eyes: surprise, maybe, but no panic. Jordan's face went pale. Ethan, he stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. I didn't know about any twin. Maya's eyes narrowed. Really? Then how could you be so sure? After all, it's not uncommon for a witness to misidentify someone in the dark, especially if they're wearing a hood. The courtroom held its breath. Jordan was clearly shaken now, his confidence crumbling under the pressure. Maya had planted a seed of doubt, one that would not be easy to dismiss. Could Jordan have been mistaken? Or was he part of something far more sinister? Isabella watched, feeling the weight of the moment. She had to make a decision soon, but the truth was slipping further away from her grasp with every passing second. Thank you, Mr. Miles, Maya said, stepping back. No further questions, Your Honor. Jordan stood there, clearly rattled, as he was escorted out of the stand. Isabella's mind was reeling. Had the prosecution been right all along? Or had they been wrong, pushing forward a case based on flimsy, questionable evidence? The trial had just entered dangerous waters. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courtroom windows, a subtle contrast to the sharp, cold tension hanging in the air. It had been days since the trial began, and yet the weight of the decision still pressed heavily on Isabella Grant's chest. She had hoped for clarity, for a definitive moment when the truth would reveal itself. But instead, the case was becoming more like a tangled web, each strand pulling her further from certainty. Today, Maya Brooks had promised to deliver the final blow, the last piece of the defense's strategy. Isabella wasn't sure if it would be enough to undo the prosecution's mounting case. But she knew one thing for sure: the court was about to hear something it hadn't expected. Your Honor, Maya's voice sliced through the courtroom, her words a calm, deliberate challenge. We are not here to deny the evidence, but we are here to shed light on the deeper truths hidden beneath the surface. Nathan Carter has been a victim of a system that sees him only as a criminal. She paused, letting the silence stretch, drawing everyone's attention closer. Maya's tone was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes, one that seemed to flicker with every word. The evidence presented by the prosecution, she continued, is circumstantial at best. It is based on an unreliable eyewitness account, a grainy security camera image, and fingerprints that could have been planted. But there is one piece of the puzzle that has not been addressed, one piece that would change everything. Isabella shifted uncomfortably in her seat. There it was again, the unease that had been creeping up on her throughout the trial. The feeling that there was something missing from the prosecution's case. Something that had slipped through unnoticed, until now. Maya stepped forward, her gaze focused on the jury as she spoke, her voice low and persuasive. We have discovered new evidence, Your Honor. Evidence that not only clears Nathan Carter of the crime, but also points directly to the real criminal. The room fell silent. Everyone turned their attention to the defense, waiting for the next revelation. Maya reached into her briefcase, pulling out a thick file. She opened it slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the contents as if she were about to reveal a secret. This, she said, holding up a series of documents, is a record of Nathan's twin brother, Ethan Carter, a man with a history of violence, a man with connections to the criminal underworld, a man who has been in and out of prison for years. Isabella's breath hitched. A twin? Nathan Carter had never mentioned anything about having a brother. She couldn't help but wonder if this was the piece she had been missing. Ethan Carter, the name hit her like a punch to the gut. Ethan Carter has been a known associate of several dangerous gangs in this city, Maya continued, her voice steady but growing more confident with each word. He has used Nathan's identity to carry out illegal activities, framing his brother in the process. Nathan, a man trying to escape his past, has been caught in the crossfire of a crime that wasn't even his. Isabella felt her heart race. This was a game changer. Ethan Carter had been hiding in the shadows, pulling strings, and using his twin brother as a pawn. Could it be possible? Could Nathan really be innocent? Maya looked directly at the jury, her eyes challenging them to see the truth. We have obtained surveillance footage from a local bar, she said, pulling out another piece of evidence. It shows Ethan Carter in the vicinity of the crime scene just hours before the robbery took place. He was wearing the same jacket Nathan wore on the night of the crime, and he even made contact with known criminals in the area. He was the one who set this whole thing in motion. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Isabella watched as the jury leaned forward, their expressions a mix of disbelief and intrigue. The defense had done it. They had found the chink in the armor, the crack that threatened to break the prosecution's case wide open. Isabella felt her pulse quicken as she processed the new information. It all made sense now. The eyewitness, who had been so certain of what he had seen, had he really been looking at Nathan? Or had he been mistaken, seeing Ethan instead? The grainy security footage, the fingerprint evidence, was it all a carefully orchestrated setup? As she thought about it, a sharp memory hit her. The night before the robbery, she had been with Nathan at a cafe, talking about the future, about leaving his troubled past behind. He had seemed so determined, so sincere. How could that same man be capable of committing the crime he was accused of? And yet, here was this new piece of evidence, pointing to a man who was everything. Nathan was not. Isabella glanced over at Nathan, sitting still at the defendant's table. His face remained expressionless, but she could see the faintest twitch of his hand. Was it hope, or something darker fear, perhaps? He knew the stakes. If Maya's argument held, everything they had worked for would fall apart. Maya's words echoed in Isabella's mind. The real criminal is out there, walking free. Could it be? Could Nathan really be the victim here? Or was this all just another ploy, another trap in a game far more complicated than anyone had realized? The jury was already whispering among themselves, their attention split between the defense's shocking revelations and the growing tension in the room. Isabella's fingers gripped the edge of the gavel, but her mind was a whirlwind of doubts and suspicions. She had always prided herself on being objective, on upholding the law with a clear and unwavering hand. But now, faced with this new evidence, she wasn't so sure. The courtroom buzzed with uncertainty. And Isabella realized that this trial was no longer about proving guilt or innocence, it was about uncovering the truth, whatever it might be. The courtroom buzzed with speculation, the air heavy with the possibility of a bombshell that could turn the trial upside down. Nathan's twin brother, Ethan Carter. The name was like a detonator, sending shockwaves through the defense and prosecution alike. Isabella could see it in the prosecutor's eyes. Isla Crow was reeling, trying to adjust her strategy on the fly. But there was something else, something more that hung in the air like a storm about to break. Judge Harrison Graves shifted in his seat, the gavel tapping lightly on the desk as he called the room to order. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice authoritative yet tinged with skepticism. "While this new evidence is certainly intriguing, we must be cautious in how we proceed. You are introducing a new element that could have a profound impact on this case. I will allow you a brief recess to present further details before we continue." Maya nodded, her face composed but her eyes burning with determination. "Thank you, Your Honor. We'll be ready." The room erupted into low murmurs as the jury filed out, the weight of the defense's claims lingering like a fog. Isabella stood up, her mind racing as she watched Nathan closely. His face had remained unreadable throughout the entire exchange, but now he seemed to shift uncomfortably in his seat. Was it relief or was it fear? "Is this really it?" she murmured under her breath, unable to tear her eyes away from the man who had been at the center of everything for the past week. She had started out certain that Nathan was guilty, or at least that he was involved in some way. But now she wasn't so sure. The pieces didn't fit together the way they used to. As the courtroom emptied for the break, Isabella stepped out into the hall, away from the oppressive eyes of the witnesses and jury. She needed to clear her head. She needed to think. "Isabella," a familiar voice called from behind her. She turned to see Daniel Reed approaching, his expression tight with concern, but with a hint of something else, something more guarded. "Are you okay?" he asked, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Isabella forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Just processing. A lot of things are changing right now." Daniel studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "I know this case has been tough for you, but you have to remember, the truth doesn't always fit neatly into the narrative we want. We have to stick to the facts." She looked at him, her stomach churning. "That's just it, Daniel. The facts. They don't make sense anymore." He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Isabella took a breath, her mind swirling with all the contradictions. The new evidence about Ethan, the inconsistencies in the eyewitness testimony, Nathan's quiet demeanor, despite the accusations. Her gut told her something wasn't right, but she couldn't place it. "I don't know, Daniel. But what if? What if Nathan didn't do it? What if he's being framed?" Daniel's eyes flickered with a brief flash of something surprise, or perhaps concern. "You're starting to doubt the case." "I'm starting to doubt everything," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep ignoring the possibility that Nathan is the victim here, not the criminal. There's too much that doesn't add up." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and earnest. "Isabella, you have to be careful. This case is more complicated than it seems. The truth doesn't always come wrapped in a neat little bow. People lie. They hide things. They manipulate facts to get what they want. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment." His words hit her like a cold wave, but beneath his caution, she could sense something else. A warning, perhaps, or a veiled threat. She couldn't tell. Daniel had always been meticulous, playing his cards close to his chest, but now something felt off. Before she could respond, Maya appeared at the door, signaling that the recess was over. Isabella nodded at Daniel, the unease between them thickening. "I'll be fine," she said, trying to steady herself. But as she turned to walk back into the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to explode. The room fell silent as the jury returned to their seats. The tension in the air was palpable, a fine line between hope and dread hanging over the defendant's table. Maya stood tall, her expression focused as she moved toward the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but brimming with confidence. "We have gathered further evidence regarding Nathan Carter's twin brother, Ethan. Our investigators have tracked down Ethan's whereabouts the night of the robbery, and we have obtained more surveillance footage that directly links him to the scene." Maya presented a series of photographs, grainy but telling. Ethan, or at least someone who looked strikingly like Nathan, was seen entering the alley behind the convenience store. The time stamped on the footage was clear. The robbery had taken place just minutes after Ethan's appearance. The prosecution's case, already shaky, was beginning to crack. "Ethan Carter is the one who committed the crime," Maya continued, her voice gaining momentum. "And Nathan Carter, while wrongly accused, has been a pawn in his brother's scheme. We ask that you reconsider the charges and dismiss them in light of this new evidence." The courtroom was still. Not a single sound broke the oppressive silence that followed. Isabella felt the weight of Maya's words sink into her chest. She glanced at Nathan once more. The truth was shifting beneath her, like quicksand, and she didn't know where it would lead. Then Isla Croce stood, her gaze locked onto Maya, with an intensity that sent chills down Isabella's spine. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, her voice icy, "this is not enough to clear the defendant. This new evidence is circumstantial at best. You cannot base an entire case on the existence of a twin brother no one knew about." The clash between the two women was immediate. Maya's sharp rebuttal against Isla's skepticism was like a spark in dry tinder. Isabella stood silently, caught in the crossfire. The courtroom was no longer a place of cold, hard facts. It had become a battlefield. A battle for Nathan's life. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, each tick of the clock adding to the mounting tension. Isabella sat rigidly, her mind swirling with all the new information. She had expected this trial to be cut and dry, an easy win for the prosecution. But now everything was up in the air. Maya's revelations about Ethan Carter had cast a shadow over everything she thought she knew. Nathan sat across from her, still silent, his face a mask of indifference. But there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of hope, maybe? Or was it fear? Isabella couldn't tell anymore. She had spent days analyzing every piece of evidence, every word spoken, but she still couldn't make sense of it all. The world she had once known as simple was now tangled in a web of contradictions. "Your Honor," Maya's voice broke through Isabella's thoughts, bringing her back to the present. "We would like to call an additional witness to the stand. Someone who can testify to Ethan Carter's whereabouts on the night of the robbery." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. Another witness? She had already seen the surveillance footage, the photographs. The case seemed to be falling apart at the seams. Was this truly a game changer? "Proceed," Judge Graves said, his voice steady but curious. He knew the stakes were high now, and whatever Maya was about to present could tip the scales one way or the other. Maya stood up, her demeanor calm but assertive. "We call Mark Davis to the stand." Isabella's brow furrowed. She hadn't heard that name before. The witness was unfamiliar, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Who was Mark Davis, and what did he know that could make a difference in this case? A man in his late 30s, dressed in a worn but neat suit, stepped into the witness box. He looked nervous, his hands shaking as he adjusted the microphone in front of him. There was something about him that didn't sit right with Isabella. His eyes darted around the courtroom, as if he was afraid of being seen, of being noticed. "Mr. Davis," Maya began, her voice gentle but firm. "Can you tell us what you know about Ethan Carter and the events of the night of the robbery?" Mark Davis swallowed hard before speaking, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't want to get involved. I was just trying to keep my head down, but But Ethan, he came to me that night. He asked me to do something for him. Isabella leaned forward in her seat, her heart pounding. This was it, the key to unraveling the truth. But as she looked at Mark, she couldn't help but feel something was off. Was he telling the truth, or was he being coerced? Maya's tone remained calm as she pressed him. What did Ethan ask you to do? Mark hesitated, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. He wanted me to provide an alibi for him. He told me to say he was at my apartment when the robbery happened. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get caught up in anything. But he threatened me. He said if I didn't help, he would make sure I'd never work again. A hushed gasp rippled through the courtroom. The weight of Mark's words settled heavily in the air. Isabella's mind raced. This was it. This was the proof they needed to expose Ethan's involvement in the crime. But the more she listened, the more questions bubbled to the surface. Why had Mark waited until now to come forward? Was this testimony reliable, or was it just another piece in a carefully crafted lie? Judge Graves leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Mark. Why did you wait until now to come forward with this information? Why didn't you report this sooner? Mark lowered his head, unable to meet the judge's eyes. I was afraid. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Ethan's powerful. He's got connections. I thought if I kept quiet, I could avoid any trouble. Isabella clenched her fists. She had heard similar excuses before. Fear, intimidation, the inability to trust the system. But was Mark telling the truth? Or was he simply trying to save himself at the expense of Nathan? She glanced over at Nathan, who remained expressionless, his gaze locked on the witness stand. Did he know something she didn't? Mr. Davis, Maya continued, her voice unwavering. Is it true that you saw Ethan Carter at the scene of the robbery? Did you witness him entering the store that night? Mark hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. No, I didn't see him at the store, but I know he was there. I'm sure of it. Isabella's gut twisted. This wasn't adding up. Mark's testimony wasn't concrete. It was based on assumptions, on what he thought he knew. His statements were full of holes, and yet the jury seemed captivated by his words. Maya was spinning this into a narrative that was difficult to ignore. But Isabella couldn't let herself get swept up in it. She had to stay grounded. She had to find the truth, no matter where it led. The defense rested their case, and the courtroom buzzed with the murmurs of the spectators. Maya had planted a seed of doubt in everyone's mind. But Isabella wasn't convinced. Not yet. There was more to this story, so much more, and she wasn't going to let this man, this trial, end with a false conclusion. As the recess began, Isabella stood up, her eyes scanning the room. Nathan was already standing, speaking quietly with his attorney, Maya. But Isabella wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Mark Davis. There was something in his eyes, something he was hiding. She had to know what it was. The recess felt longer than it should have. A moment stretched thin, with every unanswered question weighing down on Isabella's mind. She stood up from her seat, trying to maintain her composure, but her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the files in front of her. She needed answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark Davis wasn't telling the whole truth, and yet something about his story rang with a degree of sincerity. She glanced over at Nathan once more. He was still speaking to Maya, the two of them whispering quietly, their heads close together. Maya's calm demeanor remained unchanged, her eyes sharp and calculating as she assessed the reaction of everyone in the courtroom. She had planted the seed of doubt, but Isabella knew that there was still more to uncover. Isabella's attention snapped back to Mark Davis, who was standing near the witness stand, his back turned to the rest of the room. He was talking to one of the bailiffs, but Isabella could see the way his hands fidgeted, the way he avoided making eye contact with anyone. He was hiding something, and she couldn't let that go. Her gaze locked with Daniel Reed's for a split second, her colleague, sitting across the room. He'd been watching her closely, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met, and Isabella felt the weight of his silent question. Are you sure? A question she didn't have an answer to just yet. Taking a deep breath, Isabella pushed her way through the crowd and made her way towards Mark. She needed to find out why he had waited so long to come forward, and more importantly, why he seemed so anxious. Was he truly scared of Ethan, or was there something more to this? Mr. Davis, she called, her voice firm but low, so only he could hear. He turned around, startled, his eyes darting nervously. Can we talk for a moment? Mark shifted uncomfortably, wiping his palms on his pants. I don't think I should. I don't want to cause any more trouble. Isabella's eyes narrowed. You're already in trouble. You're part of this case now, but you can make it right. You just need to be honest. Mark hesitated, glancing over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. I don't know if I can trust you, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Ethan's dangerous. He has people you don't understand. He'll make me disappear. Isabella leaned in, lowering her voice to a near whisper. Ethan Carter won't intimidate me. But you need to understand, this case isn't just about you anymore. It's about Nathan. And if you're lying, you're not just putting yourself at risk, you're putting him at risk too. You have to tell me everything. What happened that night? Don't hold anything back. Mark's gaze flickered with indecision, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. She could see it. Now he wasn't lying out of malice. He was terrified, and whatever Ethan had done to him had scarred him more deeply than Isabella had realized. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, Mark spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't see Ethan at the store that night. I lied about that. But I did see him earlier, in the alley behind the building. He was there, talking to someone I didn't recognize. They were exchanging something. I don't know what, but Ethan was acting weird. He was nervous, like he was trying to hide something. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. This was different. This wasn't what she had expected to hear. This was a new lead, something she could work with. Who was he talking to? Isabella pressed, her voice urgent. What did they exchange? Mark shook his head, his face pale. I couldn't tell you. I just saw them through the window. They were too far away for me to make out their faces. But I heard Ethan say something about needing to cover his tracks. I didn't understand what it meant at the time, but now I think it's all connected. Isabella's mind raced. She had to get back to the investigation, to retrace every step of the night in question. If Ethan had been planning something with another person, if he was orchestrating the robbery from the shadows, everything was about to change. Nathan could very well be innocent, caught in the middle of a much larger plot. Thank you, Mark, Isabella said quietly, her voice softening just a little. You've done the right thing by coming forward. We'll make sure you're protected. Mark gave a small nod, his face still pale, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. As he walked away, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They had a new lead, but it was just one more piece in an ever-expanding puzzle. As she turned back toward the courtroom, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out quickly, her heart pounding in her chest as she saw the message. It was from her mentor, the one person she trusted more than anyone else in this world, David Langston. Meet me at the office. I have something important to show you. This is bigger than you think. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. What did he know? She didn't hesitate. She had to go to him. But as she made her way out of the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled into something much darker than she had ever imagined. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but with each new discovery, the truth seemed to slip further from her grasp. Isabella walked out of the courtroom, the weight of Mark Davis's words pressing heavily on her chest. The afternoon sun hit her face, but she barely felt the warmth. She was lost in thought, replaying the conversation over and over again. Ethan had been meeting someone else in the shadows. The mention of covering his tracks kept echoing in her mind. Was this all part of a bigger plan? What was Ethan really involved in? She needed to follow this lead, no matter where it took her. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking slightly, as she typed a message to Nathan. "We need to talk. Meet me at the office." She hit send, and then immediately regretted it. Was it too soon? She wasn't sure how much he knew, how much he understood about the growing complexity of the case. She couldn't afford to involve him too deeply, not yet. But she also needed his help. He had connections, and right now, those connections might be the key to unraveling the mystery. As she made her way to the office, her thoughts wandered. She had always known that the justice system was flawed, but this case felt different. This wasn't just about proving Nathan's innocence. It was about uncovering the corruption and the hidden hands that manipulated everything behind the scenes. Isabella arrived at the office to find David Langston waiting for her. The lights were dimmed, the air thick with the smell of old books and coffee. His office had always been a sanctuary, for her a place where she could think clearly. "David," she said, trying to mask the urgency in her voice, "I need your help. Something's wrong with this case. I think Ethan Carter is involved in something bigger than we thought." David looked up from the stack of papers in front of him, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Tell me what you know." Isabella quickly recounted everything Mark Davis had revealed to her. As she spoke, David's eyes narrowed. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "But it also means you're getting too close. Ethan has ties to people who are above the law, people who would do anything to keep their secrets hidden." Isabella's heart raced. Who are these people? What do they want with Nathan? David didn't respond immediately, as though weighing his words carefully. "There's a reason Ethan wasn't just a small-time criminal. He's been moving up in the ranks for years, using people like Mark Davis to cover his tracks. But there's a bigger game being played here, Isabella. And if we go any further, we're not just fighting for Nathan's innocence. We're fighting to bring down an entire network." Isabella's mind was spinning. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it felt like she was just beginning to understand the scale of the corruption. "We need to find out who Ethan's working with," she said. "I need you to get me any information you can on him. We're running out of time." David's face softened. "You're in over your head, Isabella, but I'll do what I can." As Isabella stood up to leave, her phone buzzed again. It was Nathan. "I'm here. Where are you?" She quickly typed back, "I'll be there in 5 minutes." Isabella met Nathan outside the office building, her mind racing. She didn't want to drag him deeper into this mess, but she knew she had no other choice. "Hey," Nathan said, his voice soft but filled with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" Isabella hesitated, her eyes scanning the street. There was a chill in the air, a subtle sense of danger that she couldn't shake. She had to be careful what she said. "Nathan," she began, her voice steady but urgent. "There's something I need to tell you. Something big." He frowned, stepping closer. "What is it?" "I think Ethan is connected to something much bigger than we thought. I'm talking about a network of people involved in criminal activities, maybe even organized crime. And I believe you've been caught in the middle of it." Nathan's expression faltered for a second, his brows furrowing. "Are you saying I've been framed?" Isabella nodded, her mind flashing back to the trial, to everything that didn't add up. The timestamp on the video read just moments after the robbery had been reported. "We need to figure out who's really behind this. Mark Davis, he's scared, but he's seen things. He's given us a clue. Ethan's been working with someone else, someone we don't know. And I think that person is the key to everything." Nathan took a step back, rubbing his forehead. "This is too much, Isabella. I never asked for any of this. I just wanted to get out of that mess. But now it feels like I'm sinking deeper." "You're not sinking," Isabella said quickly. stepping forward to place a hand on his arm. "I'm here, and I'm not letting you go down for something you didn't do. But we need to be smart. We need to be careful about who we trust." The silence between them grew heavy, both of them aware of the stakes. Ethan wasn't just a criminal, he was a pawn in a much larger game, and Isabella was determined to bring down the entire operation, no matter the cost. "We need a plan," Nathan said, his voice suddenly steady. "We need to take this one step at a time." Isabella nodded, feeling a spark of determination in her chest. One step at a time. But as they turned to leave, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. It was subtle, the sensation of eyes on her back, but it was enough to make her stomach twist. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a war, and she was about to walk right into the heart of it. The air inside the courthouse was heavier than ever. The buzz of reporters, the shuffle of papers, and the soft murmur of hushed conversations all blended into a singular hum. Isabella stood at the edge of the courtroom, her heart racing in her chest. Today was the day everything would change. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Nathan's name flashing on the screen. She stepped away from the crowd, her eyes scanning the room nervously. She pressed the phone to her ear. "I've got something." Nathan's voice crackled. Something big. Isabella's stomach twisted with anticipation. "What is it?" I followed a lead," Nathan said, his voice low, almost breathless. "The person Ethan's been working with, they're not just involved in the crimes we thought. It's bigger, Isabella. We're talking about a network that extends way beyond just this case. I've got proof, but it's risky." Isabella swallowed, trying to maintain her composure. "Where are you?" "Meet me at the back entrance." "We don't have much time." She hung up quickly, her heart pounding as she made her way through the crowd. The weight of the case, of the years of injustice, was pressing on her like 1,000 pounds. She was close, so close to finding the truth. But as she neared the back exit, something felt off. A subtle shift in the air, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She reached the door, but before she could open it, a figure stepped out of the shadows. David Langston. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to be here today. Not after their last conversation. Not after everything that had happened. "Isabella," David's voice was calm, too calm. "We need to talk." Her mind raced, every instinct telling her to walk away. But curiosity rooted her to the spot. "What is it, David?" "I know what you're doing," he said, his eyes hardening. "And I don't think you realize just how dangerous this is." "Dangerous?" Isabella's tone was cold, a sharp contrast to the uncertainty gnawing at her. "I'm not backing down now." David took a step closer, his gaze shifting to the door. "If you keep going down this path, you'll be putting everyone in danger. Nathan, you, even Mark Davis. There are forces at play here that you don't fully understand. I'm trying to help you." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you really working for, David?" For a moment, there was silence. The tension hung thick in the air, and then David's lips curled into something like a smirk. "I've always been working for the truth, Isabella. But sometimes, the truth is too dangerous to reveal." Before she could respond, the door to the back entrance opened, and Nathan rushed inside, his face pale and frantic. "We need to go," he said urgently. "Now." David's eyes flicked to Nathan, and for the briefest moment, there was something cold in them. But it vanished just as quickly. "You're not safe here," he said, almost as if he were warning her. Isabella didn't wait. She turned and followed Nathan down the hall, her mind a swirl of questions. What was David really hiding? What did he mean by too dangerous? And why was he suddenly so concerned? They reached the car, and as they drove away from the courthouse, Isabella looked at Nathan. He handed her a manila envelope. "This is it," he said. "Everything." She opened it, her breath catching as she saw the evidence inside. Photos, documents, and a series of recordings that implicated Ethan, and far worse, David Langston himself. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "David's involved. He's part of it." Nathan nodded, his face grim. "And that's why we have to act fast." By the time they reached the safe house, Isabella was barely holding it together. She had the proof, the smoking gun. And yet, the reality of it all felt overwhelming. Nathan sat across from her, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. They hadn't slept in days. This was it, the end game. "You're sure about this?" Isabella asked, her voice low. She was looking at the evidence one last time, making sure everything was in place. The recordings, the photographs. It all pointed to one person, David Langston. Nathan's jaw tightened. "I've never been more sure in my life. He's been playing both sides from the start. You weren't the only one he's been manipulating." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat. "Who is it?" "It's me," a familiar voice called from the other side. "Mark Davis." He had come through after all. Isabella opened the door, and Mark stepped inside, looking more disheveled than ever. He held up his hands in surrender. "I didn't want to get involved, but I don't have a choice anymore. I know about David. I know what he's been doing." Isabella looked at him, a fire igniting in her chest. "Tell me everything." Mark didn't hesitate. He explained everything he knew, the hidden deals, the money laundering, the connections to people in power. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Nathan's case. It was about the systematic corruption that ran deep within the justice system itself. David Langston had been working with some of the most powerful figures in the country, and now they were all circling in on Isabella and Nathan. Isabella looked at Nathan. They had the evidence. They had the truth. But would it be enough to bring down an entire network of criminals? As the weight of the decision pressed down on her, Isabella made her choice. She wasn't backing down. She would expose the truth. But as the sun set outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.